Buju, wago shindagu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indunjiba. A quick note on the topic of white erasure. This is a time of great change in our country. And right now, there are people of color advocating, educating, and trying to not just interrupt, but disrupt the systems that have made it much more difficult for us to live as long as white people. And all of the change is affecting many, many people in many different ways. And it's freaking some people out. There are a couple of things that I want to address that, well, I hope shine some light on this and set a few people at ease. One of them is that all of us in a place like America are steeped in a number of critical values. I would say that Americans are people who tend to believe very strongly in individualism. We speak about our last names, our accomplishments, our degrees, and after a short conversation about the weather, the next question usually is, what do you do? As if productivity is self-worth. We speak to our individual accomplishments, and we tend to value this. Up by your own bootstraps, work hard, and you too can get a piece of sweet American apple pie. This is not a criticism. It's just an observation. And I think also in America, we tend to be extremely competitive. How many board games do we have where nobody wins and nobody loses? There's one that I came across, floating, sinking islands, and you either all get off or none of you do. But for the most part, I am obliterating my children in a game of Risk or chess. Somebody wins and somebody loses. And in addition to that, we're pretty materialistic. There are a lot of reasons to get an education, but getting a job is usually one of the first ones that most people speak to. And if somebody has a lot of money, then they're often perceived as more attractive or successful, even though there are a lot of ways to define things like attractiveness or success. So these things are like strands in a braid. They work together and are central, I think, in American ways of thinking. And it sometimes gets in the way of productive and meaningful change. So, for example, because of these things, individualism, competition, and materialism, many Americans adopt the view that life is a zero-sum game, that there will be winners and losers, and we intend to win. This is why in this country we accept, tolerate, and engineer educational systems, where some schools are funded at the level of $4,000 per pupil and some at $40,000 per pupil, 10 times the amount of money spent on one school as opposed to the next one. And not just schools in the same country, but in the very same community. This kind of inequity should be intolerable to us. But because we are so competitive and individualistic, we think, as long as my kids aren't going to that loser school, that's okay. And instead of spending our energy fighting for some sort of fairness in the way we fund, we fight to keep our kids in the best funded school. In addition to that, when you think about what's going on right now with our racial demography, it's changing. In fact, the majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. And it kind of doesn't matter who wins the elections, Democrats or Republicans. We've seen both in charge, and the immigration dynamics have not significantly changed. In fact, if America getting browner is the sinking of the Titanic, we hit that iceberg ages ago. We can rearrange the furniture all we want, but this is who is here right now. So we got to figure out how to get along. But the other, obstacle in understanding this and, engineering effective and positive change is that we are all also steeped in the culture of colonization. And colonization is taking one language, religion, and culture and using it to obliterate all others. It's actually about erasure. So it is no surprise that for those who are most heavily steeped in the culture of colonization, one of the greatest fears will be fear of their own erasure. So not all, but many white Americans are afraid about white erasure. Afraid that as our demography shifts, we will flip roles between who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. And some, in response to this concern, have sought to preserve a basket of unearned advantages that have disproportionately gone to white Americans. Let's make it harder for brown people to come here, be they from Muslim countries or Mexico. Let's make it harder for people of color to vote. And these things have some effect, even though they can't overcome the tide. So there's still this angst and fear about, transferring power from one group to another. For myself, I'm not interested so much in transferring power from one group to another, but I am interested in transforming power so that we can all have a chance at a long, healthy, happy life. I don't want to fight over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed. I want to fight oppression. I don't want to compete with my fellow Americans for longevity. I want us all to have longevity. And make no mistake, I am coming for everything my ancestors were denied. But that should not freak anybody out, because by that I mean longevity. I mean dignity. I mean a chance at opportunity. And if I get to live a long life, that doesn't diminish the length of anybody else's life. Equal rights for me don't mean less rights for somebody else. If people of color rise and finish high school and go to college and get a job, that just means they're load-bearing citizens paying taxes. That does not mean that they are taking something away from somebody else. It is not a zero-sum game. And furthermore, if people of color rise, it's not just that they will be load-bearing citizens paying taxes, but they will be more fully humanized. And that will more fully humanize all of us. And in fact, if your neighbor's kids are doing well in school, it just means the teacher can work faster and more effectively with all of the kids. If your neighbor's house value goes up, it does not reduce your house value. It actually makes your house value rise. As the late, great Paul Wellstone once said, we all do better when we all do better. So I don't think that there is a reason to be afraid of white erasure. In fact, we will simply grow the resources that we have for all Americans. 100 years ago, when the women's suffrage movement was coming to fruition, a lot of men were terrified that if women got the right to vote, it would disempower men in politics. And furthermore, it would, if women entered the workforce, it would be taking jobs away from men. There were men who were taking out advertisements denigrating women and saying, here's what happens when women get the right to vote, and showing a picture of a woman sitting on a man and so forth. It's offensive and, in hindsight, also ridiculous. Women did eventually get the right to vote, and they did enter the workforce, and it did not get a whole bunch of men fired. In fact, the stock market and the economy took right off. Even though men owned most of the stocks and were the primary beneficiaries of that economic expansion, it grew the whole pie. It did not divide the pie and take a whole bunch away from men. And the same thing will happen as people of color rise. It will not be taking things away from white people. It will grow that pie for all of us. So another piece to bear in mind with this topic of white erasure is that there's one race, one. It's the human race. And these divisions between us are things that human beings made up, and we keep changing the definitions. Initially, the Irish were considered non-white and were persecuted. There was even this thing called the Black Irish. But eventually, the definition of whiteness changed from a very Anglo-Saxon definition of whiteness to something a little more expansive, and the Irish were folded into whiteness. Well, then the Italians were considered non-white, and we even passed laws to keep those non-white people out of America. Then the definition of whiteness changed again to include the Italians. In the 2000 census, if you clicked Hispanic/Latino, then that was a racial category. In the 2020 census, if you clicked Hispanic/Latino, you got a drop-down menu and you could pick Black, white, or other. And we shifted that category from a racial category to an ethnic one, which is probably more accurate. But among the things that will be happening now is that the definition of whiteness is being rewritten as we speak, and many people who are in the Hispanic Latino category are going to be folded into whiteness, which will, among other things, preserve our current racial caste system. We have to be attentive to all of these dynamics. And above all, we need to look at our fellow Americans with empathy, love, and compassion. We are all in this together. Our children and grandchildren are going to be married to one another and making babies together. And there's no way to turn back that tide. So instead of embracing the concepts of competition, individualism, and materialism to the point where we view our entire national enterprise as a zero-sum game, we should be looking at this history that we're in right now as an opportunity to engineer equity so that we can all have a chance at a long, healthy, happy life. What could be more American than that? Thank you. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.